Hi, everybody. I am Steve Clemons. I'm editor-at-large of the National Interest. I am CEO of Whitehall, and I have with me the great Joe Lavorgna, counselor to the Secretary at the Department of Treasury, where there's been a lot of construction action lately. But, you know...
Across the hallway.
You know, have you ever, hung out with the statues? So I've never understood why Hamilton was in the back and Gallatin was in the front.
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that.
You don't? You know,
I don't, but I
think
can
Gallatin,
tell you that the construction is the project's going to get done pretty quickly. I mean, they're working 24/7 on it. Yeah, it's unbelievable how much progress they've made. So it's good.
Well, you're the only one I know who can get inside to see. So there, you know.
Yeah, I'm lucky because my office is down the the opposite side of the hallway, across from the chief of staff, but it's noisy.
Oh, well, so you're in a good spot.
I'm in a good spot.
So Joe is counselor to the Secretary Bessent, and I think one of the interesting things we've been diving into was, what's the next new terrain of the U.S. economy look like? But before we get deep into that, one of the elements I've sort of been interested in are these baby accounts, the Trump accounts.
Sure.
And you had this big announcement this week. You and I haven't talked about it, but I assume it's interesting as we're talking a little bit about economic opportunity, and part of that, which we haven't gotten into much today, is asset building. And a lot of Americans don't have the beginning of asset building. Michael Dell and his wife just committed something like over $6 billion.
$6.25 billion.
Yeah, and then putting $250 and I think, what, $25 million?
$25 million.
Baby accounts? Trump accounts?
Trump accounts, yeah. Form 4547, as it will be known.
So that's what it's being known.
That's what it's like. So what'll happen? So we're very thankful to the Dells, of course, and that's in addition to what the government will do. So just so everybody understands, any child born between January 1st of 2025 and December 31st of 2028 will get $1,000 in his or her account from the U.S. Treasury. The process will start early next year, sometime around when generally your W-2s go out, where you will be able to go online, sign up, and then the monies that you want to contribute in addition to the $1,000 the Treasury will give, you could officially do that on July 4th. And then the money from Treasury will come in right around then. I don't know if it'll be on the 4th or the day after, but around that period of time. So that's $1,000. Then anything you want to add to it. The Dells added $250 in addition to the $1,000, but you can go up to $5,000 on that side. So President Trump really wants to see people build wealth, have a stake in the system, realize the power of compounding interest. The Treasury, in particular Treasury Secretary Bessent, given his background, very high on the prospect of financial literacy, meaning really wants to drive that point home and have young boys and girls that will be adults learn about investing and saving and building wealth creation, having a part of the American dream. So I think it's a really neat proposal the president put forward, and it was part of the bill that he signed in
kind of sounds like
order.
Call options on kids.
Yeah, but they're gonna pay out.
Are they gonna? Yeah,
they're gonna pay out. I mean, because it's going to be invested in a low-cost index fund, and if you believe in the U.S. economy, you believe in its long-term growth prospects, of which the U.S. has been the dominant economy in the last 100-odd years. With all the innovation, I was just listening to a little bit of the speaker before. I mean, it's an exciting time we're in. Why won't the U.S. thrive? And to President Trump's credit, he's got everybody involved in that process, and they can see their money grow. And at 18, they can have access to it. After they turn 18, we're hopeful they'll want to put more money in and grow their savings and grow their wealth.
Joe, I asked this somewhat humorously, but one of the last times we were hanging out with, you brought Secretary Bessent to a dinner I was having, and we were hanging out at Cafe Milano. He dropped by. And one of the funniest comments that he made, he said, "Steve, I spent a lot of time explaining the macro to the micro, and I'm still trying to understand what he meant."
Good question, Steve. I wasn't privy to that conversation. I think what the secretary wants, I mean, he certainly, you talked a little bit about the Trump economy, and one of the things that's important in my role is messaging what we've done. And I kind of intuitively knew it, but I think outside of a crisis, the fact that bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill, also the Working Families Act, something to that effect, was signed in record time. And the reason for that was IRS, people don't realize, have to write the guidelines. So it was one of the fastest pieces of signature legislation we've had in 90 years. And now that the guidelines are almost done, you are going to see strong capital spending. We've seen that in the data that we've got so far, but you're also going to see a tremendous amount of building. You made a comment about the East Wing, But you now, as a builder or as a company, can expense an entire factory, full expensing up to 2028, 100%. Think about that. You could expense it in year one, and normally the depreciation cycle is almost 40 years. So it's going to be a huge spending boom, which means a huge construction boom, which means more jobs, high-paying jobs. And then when that factory is there and it's built, that's going to produce the goods or services that people want in the United States. So you're broadening out the manufacturing base, creating high-paying jobs, and by increasing the productive capacity of the economy, you will also tend to lower the inflation rate. So it's a really neat policy that has yet to really even been felt yet. So we're going to see that next year. I think it's going to get people much more excited and upbeat on America's future growth prospects.
Joe, I used to be obsessed with interviewing America's mayors, and I found out very early on that some, like Rahm Emanuel was a data mayor in Chicago, but Dallas didn't have a data mayor. He wouldn't know, and he said, okay, what's that? And he turned himself into one. He got a dashboard, like a little Apple notebook, feeding him data on fire stuff, police stuff, whatever. And I said, how do you know you're winning? What are you watching? He said, look, the most important thing I know, whether I'm winning or losing, is whether the real estate values in South Dallas are rising. Because if they're not, then I'm not succeeding in part of what I need to do. I'm really interested in how Treasury looks at whether it's winning or losing. What are the, because there's so many data points out there that we could be looking at. But what do you look at in terms of what equities we're trying to enhance in a very complex economy?
We have top-down GDP that looks very good. Second quarter, we grew 3.8. Ex-federal spending, we were up 4.5. Atlanta Fed has GDP at 3.8 again. In the third quarter, like the second quarter, whenever those numbers become reported or become official, you're going to see it in the private sector. GDP looks great. The shutdown certainly hurt us in the fourth quarter. We'll get some of that back in Q4, but the economy looks to be doing pretty well from a GDP perspective. The labor market's a bit on a fulcrum. The labor market was slowing dramatically under the prior administration. Jobs were revised down 2 million over the 23-24 period. I'm sorry, but the Trump administration did not inherit a good labor market. The fact that we've got an environment, we've got such low hiring and low firing, I think is testament to the confidence that the president is a businessman, knows how the economy works, will build and make sure the economy thrives. So what I'm watching for will be a continuation of strong GDP growth. But in light of the capital spending I highlighted and in light of the factory boom we anticipate, one of the things we should expect to see next year, and the Secretary's mentioned this, is much faster job gains. So if we have GDP at 3% and job growth turning up and the Fed easing rates, because we need the Fed to ease rates because the economy cannot hit its full potential if those rates are high. Certainly on a building perspective, that impacts things. But the economy could perform incredibly well, even better than it did under the first Trump term, because the deregulation policy, I think, is more broad. You've got the energy abundance. We've solidified the tax cuts and added additional supply-side growth initiatives. So employment, GDP, we should see an improvement in manufacturing data. The various purchasing manager series that come out from various jurisdictions will look better. So, I think, and you'll see it in the sentiment numbers. You'll see consumers being much more upbeat as President Trump's policies are delivering.
You had this kind of annoying little tiny uptick in inflation. So does that worry you? I mean, it worries some at the Fed. So does it get in the way of rates coming down?
Well, the Fed, there's a debate on the Fed. There are some bunch of hawks, which I totally disagree with, and the doves that want to cut. I mean, the Fed should be cutting interest rates because, as I mentioned earlier, interest-sensitive spending is weak. Number two, if you look at things when rates are high, that means the dollar is high. And contrary to what the financial press tell you, if you look at the dollar in real trade-weighted terms, it's very high. If you look at the yield curve, its slope, the difference between long and short rates, it's really flat. That means rates are high. The Fed's own estimates have said rates are high. So there's a lot of factors. If the Fed cuts, that's certainly going to help. But, on the growth side, I'd be arguing for lower rates to get the economy moving more quickly. It's sort of the grease, the skid, what's the expression? I say path forward or grease the skids of acceleration. So I do think the Fed should be cutting and will. But if they keep rates high, it's gonna hurt us. On inflation. So on inflation, the Fed's making a mistake. Some, not all. That tariffs are inflationary. They're not. And if you look at inflation, what you see actually is inflation not having gone up like people have thought. inflation is above the Fed's target, but you know where the excess inflation is? It's not in goods, which is where tariffs would theoretically show up as a one-off price level adjustment. It's in services. And I do think we're going to see service inflation come down based on some leading indicators of housing, rents, and some other variables that suggest you're going to get some moderation. So that little uptick, no, it should moderate.
So maybe this is, not, I love numbers, and so thank you. I've been waiting for a lot of these numbers all day, so we're really happy you're here. You've got rising concern in America about affordability. What's happening in affordability, prices, how do you see it going? And, we're going to have Jameson Greer here later, and we've been talking a lot about every dimension of the ecosystem of the economy, from critical materials to, data centers to, need for new power, but also looking at rebalancing the economy and manufacturing. All of this, fits in this sort of economic equation that you're looking at. But, one of the nagging things out there was American anxiety about, cost of living.
So again, I would say the way you deal with affordability is increasing people's purchasing power. So how do you do that? Well, when you expense capital at 100% CapEx and you're seeing the data start to turn, history shows every time that's correlated with rising job growth. And if you have rising CapEx, capital expenditures, alongside what has been higher productivity because of the global innovation and technology which the U.S. leads, not only do you get more jobs, you get higher paying jobs. We've got the factory build, so I mentioned high-paying jobs. You can look in the data, and you'll see that if you're in construction, you get paid higher than average wage rates. So the bill that the president signed of the full expensing of CapEx, the full expensing of factories, means you're going to get more jobs and higher-paying jobs. Third piece is the no tax on overtime and tips, and that is going to increase people's after-tax wages. They may get faster wages because they're in demand, but they're going to get to take home more of their pay because they're going to be incentivized to work harder. They go overtime and not being taxed on. So that's another way to get their take-home pay, the money in their pocket, higher, and that also is going to offset affordability concerns. And again, assuming interest rates come down and inflation will moderate, we had some good data this week. Import prices are basically flat. There's no growth there. Gasoline prices as of this week just edged down below $3 a gallon for the first time since May of 21. So there's a lot of good stuff happening. I understand people's frustration, but we're moving in the right direction. So that's how we're going to do affordability. We're going to get those prices down that we can get lower, and then people are going to make more.
And one of the big macro things that sort of seems to be hanging out there, according to some, like a guillotine over the neck of the country, is debt. Huge, 34, I think it's 34, maybe it's more $1 trillion. When and how do we begin dealing with that? Do you think it matters?
Well, it certainly matters. And the Secretary has been clear. A lot of this debt, unfortunately, happened recently and it was outside our control. It was in the prior administration, increased debt dramatically. You need growth. Without growth, you've got nothing. You're never going to cut your way to prosperity. You need a strong, durable economy that works for middle and lower class households, which you saw in the first Trump administration when median household income rose over $6,000 in those years immediately before the pandemic, which was the largest gain over a 2-year period than what we had in the prior 16, both Democrat and Republican administrations. So that's a very important development. You need to grow. The deficit looks like it went from 6.4, 6.5 last year, or fiscal year 24, to slightly below 6 in fiscal year 25. Given what we've seen on the tariffs and given where we think growth is and what we think revenues will do, broadly speaking, those deficit numbers should come in, and the Secretary thought we could get to a 3 handle on the deficit to GDP ratio, certainly by the end of the Trump administration term, and that'll help a lot stabilize those long-term concerns.
Right before President Trump was inaugurated, I got together a lot of the former Trump administration trade officials, some that worked in Treasury. And I learned something I'd never read in the press, which is there was pretty fine-tuned monitoring of tariffs, impact on industry and market share, lots of communication with industry. The exemptions were given were sort of empirically dictated by, what they were seeing in this. I have no idea whether that happens in your shop or whether it happens. Is there something like that going on now? Because we hear a lot about the headlines about tariffs, but we're not hearing about, how it's fine-tuned, whether there's sort of an awareness inside the shop on what the impact of tariffs will be and whether, because they're blunt instruments sometimes. And so, the broad side is what I got, and I have to give them credit, really fascinating understanding of part of what the Trump administration did in round one when Bob Lighthizer was there. Is that happening now?
So my analysis suggests that the bulk of the tariff has been effectively absorbed by the exporter. And that's happened because they lower their price to offset what the effective tariff would be. We have yet to see any meaningful increase in goods prices because of tariffs. What tariffs have done in the short term is raise a tremendous amount of money. And as Secretary Bessent has talked about, tariff revenues in some sense are like a melting ice cube, because what we ideally want is domestic production to come here. So as that's happening, you need the tariff to do it, because the tariff is the incentive or the cudgel to get the foreign capital to come into the U.S. The foreign capital is encouraged to come in because the tariff wants them to come in so they don't have to pay the tariff. And you get the added benefit of low corporate tax rates, pro-business, pro-growth deregulatory policies, and cheap and abundant energy, which you need to run a factory, which is, most places of the world, is energy costs are high, just like what's happening in Europe. So the tariff
and
is
in the US.
and into the U.S. to some extent. And there's issues as it relates to climate initiatives in some of these states having very, very high costs because they're not using maybe the traditional sources of energy as much as they should. But the point is, the energy sector on the gas side is weakening. And ideally, what these tariffs will do is it will encourage a broader and deeper manufacturing base in specialized high value, which is high wage manufacturing jobs. So the tariff is a necessary ingredient of that.
So I know there are different views on this in the administration. Do you believe what the administration is doing now in these kind of targeted national security sectors, constitutes industrial policy? I just want to know if that,
Industrial policy has like a pejorative term.
Yeah, and I don't mean to make it pejorative. So, let me just add one element.
Yeah, sure.
So I think it's sort of like industrial policy, and I think one of the interesting questions is, and this is why I'm interested in the fine tuning of it. During the Obama administration, 08-09 crisis, you couldn't say the word, but clearly, in the auto sector, they were doing industrial policy and you're kind of moving along. And then I think President Trump has said it. But I think it's something America has not been good at. I mean, has not necessarily known. We don't have that muscle memory for being a great industrial policy. So I'm just wondering how we're bringing people along and making progress quickly in that space without having a school to say, hey, we're now the industrial policy or some other framing for it.
Yeah, the administration, and those other administrations is really about picking winners and losers. This administration is trying to set up a groundwork where people want to come and do business in the U.S. because it's attractive on so many levels. And that tariff, which is broad-based across the board, is designed to initiate that. And therefore, I wouldn't call it an industrial policy. I'd call it sort of an economic security policy, because as the secretaries mentioned, the interconnectivity of national security and economic security is incredibly tight. And so even to the extent that people talk about, we want high value added manufacturing jobs. To the extent that you've got lower industry jobs, people will say are never coming back, that misses the point, because if some of that work goes outside China to other places that are more US friendly, you're delinking supply chains. So they're not as integrated, we're not so dependent as we realized back in 2020, all the personal protective equipment. So you need the tariffs, even in that regard, to sort of make sure our supply chains are stronger, that we're not so dependent on China for necessary product in times of crisis or whenever.
Last question here. I remember talking many years ago to Clyde Prestowitz, who was a Commerce Department official in his trade. And I think that time the American trade imbalance was like $2 billion or something. And Secretary Brock, hired him to basically, I want you to knock that down. And so, Clyde always tells the story, and I don't know if it's true or not. He says, well, give me a percentage of the action for every bit I get the trade deficit down. And of course, it went radically the different direction. But as you kind of look at things, because I know it's very much on the president's mind, the trade deficit, but trade deficits are also a function of savings and investment. What are the real opportunities here to deal with a huge structural trade imbalance, not just with China, but with the world?
But the bulk of it is with China.
Yeah.
And the U.S. is the biggest economy, and we're the biggest export market. what did the president say? He made a great comment of something like, I'm getting this wrong, but we're the best department store. Everybody wants to come and shop here. Something to that effect. I think that was it. And the thing is, China subsidizes its industry, and there's intellectual property that we've lost. There is not a level playing field, and that didn't exist 20 years ago before China was in the World Trade Organization. And the problems when you talk about Clyde Prestowitz, that was much earlier when deficits, as you said yourselves, are very small. Now they've become large.
Staggering.
But it also creates national security risks. And the president, to his credit, has been ahead of this for years and years, decades even. And we're confident that our policies, if we institute them and follow them, we will create a much more durable, strong manufacturing base, and with that, strong and high wages and a resilient economy.
What is Secretary Scott Bessent's biggest concern in the economy right now?
I think, well, I don't know if he's got a big concern on the economy. I think we're very happy with the work we've done, and I appreciate me coming, and Ambassador Greer may make somewhat similar comments, but we're happy that we could just message what we've done, and we feel like, look, this is going to work. People say, well, the other administration said their policies are going to work, but we're totally different. This is supply side, private sector-led initiatives to strengthen and build out the economy, and we're going to see how this plays out, and I'm pretty confident, and the Secretary I know agrees that that'll happen. So I guess maybe I don't want to put words in his mouth, maybe just counsel a little bit of patience. Let's get to next year. The things are looking up.
I am so patient.
Yeah.
I'm kind of patient, except on energy.
Yeah, well,
and now you've got to bring Secretary Bessent to one of my other parties because I got to get some clarity on this macro micro.
Yeah, I'll ask him, and you could also, and my colleague
okay?
Alexandra, who you know very well, but yeah, I would like to know myself.
I just think it's one of the greatest lines from any Treasury sector everywhere. It's like totally enigmatic.
Yeah, that's a good comment. I'm going to find out myself.
So Joe Lavorgna, counselor to Secretary Bessent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Joe. Thank you.
Steve.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.